Boa tarde, bem-vindas e bem-vindos. Olá, Taisa. Olá, Flávia. Olá, Ruth. Hello, Daniel. Hello, everybody. We will do a short introduction in Portuguese, and Daniel will then talk in English with Portuguese subtitles. My name is Tatiana, eu sou Tatiana Lorenz do Goethe Institute, São Paulo. Eu coordeno o projeto Zona da Mata, que aborda a regeneração, por uma cultura e agricultura urbana. A gente fala também de economia circular, entre outros. E a missão do Goethe Institute é promover o aprendizado da língua alemã e fomentar o intercâmbio cultural. E dois dos grandes temas para os próximos anos serão como surge o novo no mundo, onde nós direcionamos um olhar para o futuro através de estratégias criativas e inovadoras. E o segundo tema é ecologia e sustentabilidade. Então, ambos esses temas vão ao encontro do ciclo design regenerativo. E eu estou muito contente com a realização desse segundo webinar, Design Bioinspirado. Esse formato é inovador e muito inclusivo. Nós tivemos 350 inscritos de todos os cantos do mundo e do Brasil. E isso é incrível. Agradeço a todos que estão conosco também. E eu quero agradecer muito ao Daniel Wahl. Agradeço também a Flávia Vivacqua, da Nexo Sistêmico, e a Taisa Mattos, da Conecta Ecossocial, da Conecta Ecossocial, desculpa, pela construção dessa parceria. Agradeço a Ruth também, que está conosco, fazendo essa facilitação. Agradeço a toda a equipe técnica da STN, que nos ajuda com a legendagem e torna toda essa tradução possível. E agradeço a Priscila Molina pela tradução. Então, eu desejo a todos um excelente webinar e deixo vocês agora com a Flávia.
Bom, boa tarde para todos. De fato, é uma alegria a gente estar aqui reunindo hoje. O ciclo design regenerativo, ele é um sonho de alguns anos e aonde a vinda do Daniel para o Brasil e aonde inclui essa série de webinars e os encontros presenciais, assim como a tradução do livro e a publicação em português, se tornou um passo fundamental para que a gente consiga trazer o conceito de regeneração, mas também um entendimento profundo que se torne uma prática no Brasil hoje. Então, esse é o nosso principal objetivo aqui. E as parcerias que se estabeleceram nesse período, elas não são à toa, né? Elas não são qualquer parceria, são pessoas que estão engajadas e que estão muito conscientes do que isso significa. Então, essa é a postura do Goethe Institute, essa é a postura da Taisa Mattos pela Conecta Ecossocial, e é também uma honra ter a Ruth hoje fazendo essa facilitação, que é uma das primeiras pessoas no Brasil a trazer o conceito de pensar, né, a forma produtiva, como é que a gente vive e produz de forma regenerativa. E honra plena aqui de ter o Daniel Wahl com a gente essa tarde. E vamos aí, seja ótimo.
Então, boa tarde, gente. Boa tarde para vocês. Boa noite para mim, que estou aqui na Inglaterra. Também foi super, super bacana ter recebido esse convite para eu poder participar um pouquinho do ciclo de design regenerativo que está acontecendo aí no Brasil. Bom, eu vou estar facilitando essa hora com vocês e eu tenho algumas mensagens, alguns recados para dar antes da gente começar. O primeiro é falar um pouquinho dessa estrutura. Nós teremos mais ou menos uma apresentação do Daniel de 30 a 35 minutos e depois o resto do tempo nós vamos receber e responder perguntas. E tem uma coisa muito importante. Aqui embaixo do Zoom, no menu do Zoom do programa do webinar, vocês vão ver um quadradinho escrito Q e A, Q&A. Esse é o quadradinho onde vocês vão clicar e colocar as perguntas enquanto o Daniel faz a apresentação dele. So, I'm just going to say that in English. If you're watching this and you don't speak Portuguese, I'm sorry. Today we're going to have about between 30 and 35 minutes. Daniel will just make a presentation, and then we're going to have some time for questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, there is a button on the Zoom menu just at the bottom of your screen, which you can click, and then you can just type a question. And this is the best place for you to be fielding questions during Daniel Wahl's presentation, which we'll take at the end. Right. O que mais que eu tenho que falar? Legenda. A gente vai estar falando em inglês, o Daniel vai fazer a apresentação em inglês, responder as perguntas em inglês, mas se você falar em português, tem essa mágica incrível, pela primeira vez eu estou vendo isso no Zoom, que dá para você ter legendas em português. Para isso, vocês precisam clicar também o botão que está escrito Closed Caption, e o botão tem que ficar verdinho, aí vocês conseguem enxergar a legenda. Qualquer problema, escreve aí no chat que a Flávia e a Taisa vão estar ajudando vocês. Bom, que mais? Just to say in English that there will be subtitles in Portuguese, so you need to click the button that says closed caption at the bottom of your menu, and then you will get simultaneous translation or consecutive translation as a subtitle in Portuguese. So it's also an opportunity if you want to learn Portuguese. Right, vamos parar de falar e deixar o Daniel vir apresentar o que ele veio apresentar hoje. E a partir de agora eu vou falar inglês porque vocês estão vendo a legenda em português. So from now on, I'm going to speak English because the people who only understand Portuguese can read the subtitles. It is a pleasure to be here tonight, well, today, and to listen to Daniel Wahl again. We've been working quite closely together on a series of really interesting projects, all connected to regeneration. And Daniel is someone I admire a lot, especially because of his generosity with his knowledge and his experience. I think he's one of the people that I see giving a lot to the world in terms of describing what regeneration means and how can we embody the practice in our lives. So without further ado, Daniel Wahl.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you everybody for making time to come to this webinar. The admiration is mutual, Ruth. I think that Ruth is one of the people who really embodies what regeneration is all about, weaving networks of collaboration so more people can build their capacity and act positively at restoring ecosystems locally, regionally, and globally. And Ruth is doing wonderful work with that, and I'm glad to be able to help every now and then. So thank you so much for this second webinar. Again, also the way that this is coming together, that it's actually possible to speak for me to speak in English and for there to be simultaneous translation into Portuguese and then simultaneous subtitling so you can follow the subtitles. For me is an example of what can happen when we shift from competitive advantage to collaborative advantage, which I think is one of the transitions that are at the heart of moving towards regenerative cultures. We can just do so much more if we work together. And so as Ruth said, I will start with a short half-hour presentation, and then I open up to questions. I'm just looking how to share my screen. This is the one I want to share. And now this should work. Okay, now it looks like I've got two screens here. So if you see me looking off center, it's because I'm looking at a screen just slightly there. The topic of this webinar is systemic bio-inspired design. And it's part of a series of two webinars to as a warm-up to my visit to Brazil. And I'm really looking forward to this visit in March and giving a talk at Goethe Institute and also a short workshop at Goethe Institute. And you can find out more at designregenerativo.org. And just to distinguish that this webinar is not about bio-inspired design in terms of biomimicry levels 1 and 2, which is basically the examples of how we can innovate new products that are inspired by the way that nature, with its 8 billion year head start in research and development, has innovated wonderful solutions that we can learn from, of course. And the most important thing here to reiterate from what I said in my last webinar is that while very often, I think I just did it myself, we use language that says learning from nature, as if nature is something out there and we're somewhere separate from it. The key internal reframing that we need to do to work regeneratively is to first and foremost understand that we are nature, and that at the very best, we can design as nature, creating conditions conducive to life. And really that's what this is about. And just briefly, these examples here that you've got on the screen at the moment are all biomimetic design innovations. All the images are from my book. So I also speak about the product design level, but in this webinar, I wanted to focus more on the systemic level. So as you can see here on the screen, there's ways to optimize the aerodynamics of a car and the stability of a car following biological models. There's ways to create fast swimming swimsuits or hospital interiors that don't allow bacteria to attach, mimicking the way that the shark skin is structured. And we have all, or many of us have seen how the wings of airplanes kind of tipped up at the end of the wing over the last years, because it makes them more aerodynamic, more using less fuel and more stable. And that's an innovation that is copied from birds of prey. So rather than staying with the product design level, I said I wanted to speak to you today about the third level of biomimicry, which is biomimicry that is inspired by biological and ecological processes and systems. And this map is a map of the world's biomes, meaning it's a distribution map of the type of ecosystems that we have around the globe. And as we begin to rematch the human presence onto the biological and ecological patterns of nature, because we've kind of divorced ourselves from it through being somewhat overly focused of what technology can do and not paying enough attention of how even our highest technology needs to fit into the life-sustaining cycles of nature if we want to use it for any length of time, and if we don't want to go extinct in a hurry. And so this map of looking at where the key ecosystems are is a good point to start of how to rematch ourselves, learning from nature, how to be part of nature again, and how to become a healing, regenerating influence on the ecosystems we inhabit. This image taken from the International Space Station, it shows the Mediterranean, and right in the center you can see the island of Mallorca, and you can see a very lit up Half Moon Bay, and right in the center of that is where I'm sitting right now in Palma de Mallorca. And I like this image because it shows how at night we really light up the planet with our unsustainable use of energy, which unfortunately is still by and large coming from non-renewable energy sources and nuclear. And if we want to redesign the human presence on Earth, we have to shift fundamentally from these energy sources, nuclear also being a non-renewable source, to renewable energy sources. And the image also shows, when you look at that just above the curvature of the globe, you see that green line, and it gives you an idea of how small or how relatively low the atmosphere actually is. And between the Earth and that upper layer, in in that layer of air is where everything that we've ever done as a species has taken place. And all our actions, well, apart from a very few exceptions when we traveled beyond that sphere, but all our actions have had consequences on this living planet, life as a planetary process that we're participating in. And with the converging crises that are coming at us, we're now really challenged to redesign our human impact on Earth in such a way that we fit back into this system and that we heal this system. So the big question is, this is another map of the Earth built up from satellite images, and you can see that there are large areas that are deserts. And unfortunately, because of human action over the last 5,000 years, we have drastically increased the deserts. And the question is, what would it take if we actually started to inhabit each of these diverse ecosystems that the previous map showed, but do it in such a way that we try to bring that ecosystem to its peak productivity, to capture the most amount of carbon and store it in soil, store it in biomass, store it in the biomaterials we use, and in the process draw down carbon from the atmosphere and reverse global warming and climate change, avoid runaway cataclysmic climate change, and make that shift towards regionally focused biomaterial cultures. And of course, the world isn't going to look quite like that because of the way that global climate patterns create desert areas, but with ingenuity and careful attention to the biocultural uniqueness of place, we can do a lot. And these images from the Loess Plateau in China show that it really isn't a question of feasibility, it's a question of leadership and a question of commitment and a question of will. Whether we leave the eroded landscapes of the planet to continue to degrade further and become less and less bioproductive and become more and more of a driver of global warming, or we reforest and we make soils fertile again, and in the process actually avoid early extinction as a species, because that's really what we might be facing if we don't act now. These images are also from the Loess Plateau, and just to give you an idea of the scale of this, it's a 35,000 square kilometer area, of which so far only 5% have been restored, but that's still hundreds of square kilometers. And all those images show that we can really, within a relatively short period of time, bring back in 15 years a much lusher, much more verdant environment, and also with that bring back the river systems, bring back the water. Because as Ernst Goethe, who is one of my great heroes from Brazil, said, we plant water. We need to plant the trees and work with the soil and increase carbon in the soil, and then water will flow again, and even the hydrological cycle will function again, and the rains will start falling again, and fountains that have long been dry will start flowing again. This is really possible, and we've demonstrated it over and over again. Another series of maps that Robert Zooks has produced, which might help us to rematch our human ways of meeting needs onto the patterns of bioregions, is this map of the world's river systems. And you can see, these are not to scale, but you can see in the bottom right corner, that's Spain. And you can even see Mallorca, the island that I speak to you from, in the very far right corner. And you can see some of the watersheds are enormously big and others are smaller. And of course, gigantic watersheds like the Mississippi watershed or the Amazon watershed might be 1 or 2 or 3 bioregions or clusters of bioregions. But simply by looking at these hydrological maps, we get an idea of what natural patterns on Earth actually predictate in terms of what's possible, and then follow these patterns along with overlaying patterns of the ecosystems I showed earlier to look at how we can improve the way we work with land so it is at its most bioproductive, because fundamentally all our economic activity is dependent on this primary bioproductivity, on the way that plant life can capture solar energy and CO2 and turn it into cellulose and other materials that we can then use for our purposes, but also it's important to not see it as only utilitarian value. It's intrinsic value. We need to be stewards of the biodiversity of life in all these diverse watersheds and ecosystems in order to increase the capacity to respond and to increase the resilience of these systems to change and transformation. Because one thing we know for certain, life is always going to keep changing. We live in a dynamic planet, in a dynamic universe. And so we will never be able to stand still. We'll always have to adapt. And diversity is one of the key elements that makes us able to adapt to more, to bigger disruptions in ways that give us a greater chance to meet our needs in the future. And so this is all by ways of introduction. And in the announcement for this webinar, I said that I was going to focus on three main terms that people talk about a lot, but it might help to review what they actually mean. And the first one of them is this word, what is resilience? And when you look at resilience, there's on the one hand, the capacity of an ecosystem to persist in the face of disruption, of changes from the outside. Or another way of saying it is absorbing or coping with these disruptions in such a way that the structure and the function of the system stays the same. And then when the disruption becomes too much, or the intervals of the disruption become so frequently that the system cannot cope anymore, then the next level would be adaptive capacity, which is to change the structure of the system slightly in order to still be able to maintain the functions. And both of these depend critically on the levels of diversity and also the levels of redundancy, how at different scales certain functions are repeated, and we don't maximize by scaling up everything and then we take out redundancies which normal economic theory would ask you to, and by that we create brittler systems. So keeping the capacity to meet basic needs both at the local, the regional, the national, and the global scale at the same time. So when there is a disruption, we can use backup systems that happen at different scales. And another key component of resilience is transformative capacity. And this only happens in socio-ecological systems. But basically all systems that we participate in on this planet, are now socio-ecological systems. Because we live in the Anthropocene, there is not a place on Earth that isn't somehow affected by the actions of humanity and the way we interact socially with each other and with the environment. But critically here, our capacity for foresight and anticipation, the way that now we're waking up to the fact that we've created over 250 years of rapid technological evolution and industrialization, that we've created systems that have increasingly eroded resilience and biodiversity, and that we have started anthropogenic climate change that has become worse to the point that we're now facing imminent runaway climate change. All these, the fact that we're beginning to see the problem and the fact that we are beginning to understand we need to do something about this adds to this system of humanity in nature, of us being part of nature, the capacity to say, okay, we might have made mistakes, but we can respond to them now, and we can increase the capacity of the system to respond to the changes that are coming at us. And so this is the third level of resilience, that we as life, being part of the community of life, add to social ecological systems. And don't worry, this is a lot to cover in a talk. At the end, I give you some resources where you can follow up some reading if you want to repeat some of this and go deeper into it. Another thing that I said that I was going to talk about and explain a little bit more about in this talk is what is called the adaptive cycle. And what's really important to understand here is that resilience theory isn't just some kind of detached academic theory. It is the result of 50 years of studying change dynamics within ecosystems and ecosocial systems, and to look at common patterns and to understand how change and transformation happens in these systems. And this adaptive cycle is kind of a distillation, the essence of some of that understanding. And that's why on the cover of my book, Design de Culturas Regenerativas in Brazil, you can see the same image repeated because it is central to what designing regenerative cultures is about. The capacity to adapt and transform in response to changing environmental conditions and changing social conditions is what regenerative cultures need to grow and need to improve on. And so let me just talk you briefly through this adaptive cycle. It's basically best to start at the blue arrow, which is when the system is starting to, if you think about it in terms of a clearing or a forested area, like the forest areas in California that have been leveled by wildfire last summer. And then when ecological succession starts to happen and the first species come in and then succession plants come in and take over, and eventually you get a series of successions that lead to a peak canopy, peak productivity ecosystems, which is when you get into the green arrow, where rather than lots of, like the reason why where it says in blue growth and the little r, that's R selection. R selections are species that produce lots of seeds, and some of them survive, but most of them don't. And then in the second, in the green arrow, conservation happens, where K-selected species are favored, which are basically species that produce just a few offspring, but care for them a lot, which is most of the mammals and particularly us. And when you're in these systems where the green arrow gets to the top, then the amount of free capital is, like, most capital is locked up, most nutrients are locked up in the system, and most connections that can be made are already made, most relationships are already defined, and so the system becomes rigid. And as the environment changes, it might not serve the new conditions anymore. And really that's where we are at the moment. We've created a globalized economy that is quite rigid in the way it structured access to capital and access to resources, and it has created an enormously brittle system, particularly because we've divorced ourselves from the rest of nature and nature's ability to create abundance for all of life. And so then you move into this breakdown stage where the existing patterns don't serve any longer, and we need to release structures that don't serve and move into, from breakdown into breakthrough, move into experimenting rapidly with new options and reorganizing the capacity of the system to respond to the new conditions. And so this loop happens whether it's in the patch in a forest where just a tree fell, or where it's in an entire forest ecosystem in an area in California. It happens at different scales, at different time scales. And so nature is this nested system of these dynamic change loops happening all the time. And Arthur Koestler gave us this idea of a holarchy. When we work regeneratively, we always have to think of where does what we do sit in relationship to the next larger whole? Where does our community sit in our bioregion? Where does our bioregion sit within our national patterns of doing things? And where do our nation states sit within the global patterns of life creating conditions conducive to life? How do we collaborate between nations to increase planetary bioproductivity in such a way that we create abundance for all? And so as you can see in this diagram, these patterns of change that are described by the adaptive cycle are also nested at the local, regional, and global scale. And sometimes when a system is in that breakdown phase, the red phase, it can lead to a revolt at the next level up. It can create innovations that then, like local innovations, can become innovations at the biosphere, at the bioregional scale. And bioregional scale innovations can then also affect the national scale. So in many ways, what seems to be the case in ecosystems is that innovations are local and then spread into the global. And that's a lesson for us as we redesign the human presence on Earth, our impact on Earth. We need to start locally and bioregionally and then spread patterns that work between bioregions, but always with sensitivity to the unique conditions of those bioregions. And this is both scale linking work in terms of spatial scale linking, but also in terms of temporal scale linking, because these big patterns at the global scale are much slower, or the patterns at large biome levels, like the regional patterns, are slower again than the change at the regional level. And so one key lesson to take from this is that breakdown is nothing that we should fear. Breakdown is part of these change cycles. We need to have breakdown at different scales in order to have innovation at different scales. And we need to maintain connection between the local, the regional, and the global, working globally and locally, if we want to succeed in creating a regenerative culture. And in my book, there's also this diagram that talks about the scales of regenerative design, which is basically looking at how, from the material science shifting to biomaterials, to new types of product designs made from biomaterials, to new type of architecture that are also based on wood and biopolymers that lock carbon into the built environment, to new types of community design that see trees as part of a public health infrastructure and more holistically integrate the more than human parts of nature into our urban settlements, and then linking our industrial processes in such a way that they are closed loops, and that one process's waste becomes another process's resource, just mimicking, again, biomimetic innovation at the ecosystems level, mimicking what ecosystems do, and building new types of industrial system, closed loop biomaterial industrial systems at the bioregional scale. And then co-locating or locating our urban patterns within the patterns of the bioregion, really marrying again how the city relates to the resource flows of its bioregions. All of that is described in my book in a lot more detail, and I can't go into too much detail right now because I really would like to have some questions. So I'm just going to move on. I know this is a bit of a tour de force with a lot of very technical concepts. I hope the translator is coping. And all of this for me is contextualized within what I said earlier, the fact that we are, as life, capable of creating conditions conducive to life. And if we understand this within the context of the evolutionary story, then we can see that while competitive behavior does exist in nature, it normally within groups, selfish competitive behavior sometimes beats altruistic behavior. But if you have a group where too much competitive behavior happens, then it doesn't compete very well with other groups. So this is called multi-level selections. So basically groups which can collaborate and be altruistic outcompete groups that are full of competitive individuals. And so we need to understand that as life has evolved, it has evolved through a process of diversification and then subsequent reintegration of that diversity at higher levels of complexity. And this reintegration happens more often than not through collaborative processes. And we are now faced in this multi-level selection kind of way with global crises coming at us as one species, where the only way we can respond viably in a way that we will have a future as humanity is to make that shift from thinking that it's all about competitive advantage to that shift towards collaborative advantage. And learning from how ecosystems do this all the time is what I call systems level bio-inspired innovation and design. And so just lastly, we are really at what I would call a species level rite of passage. We have been an immature young species taking more than we give back. We have by and large been a degenerative presence on Earth, on the ecosystems. We now call this era the Anthropocene because we've become a geological force. I would prefer to call it the Ecozoic, the era where we finally understand that we need to reintegrate ourselves into the ecosystem. And Otto Schama and others have worked with this shift from ego to eco. And I quite like this illustration that I found on the internet where we go from ego to eco to seva. Seva being the Sanskrit concept of being in service of. And really, that is at the heart of regenerative cultures. Regenerative cultures create elegant solutions carefully adapted to the biocultural uniqueness of the places they inhabit. And they do so in ways that are in service to the full community of life and in service to all of humanity. So it's not about coming back into some kind of self-sufficiency, locking down and survival mode, community by community or bioregional by bioregion. It's about matching our patterns to the natural patterns in our bioregions, but doing so in global collaboration. And if you think back to that map at the beginning of the ecosystems, we can learn a lot from each other. People in similar biomes in different parts of the planet will face different climatic and challenges, and will also face similar access to resources and similar access to water. And all of that, the way they overcome that, the way they find creative innovations to match meeting human needs within the limits of their specific ecosystems and within planetary boundaries. That's what we can exchange globally. And that's why it's so important to collaborate, both in terms of stewarding the commons, but also in terms of peer-to-peer open source innovation. And I touched on a lot of things, not a lot in much detail, but that's the nature of only having 40 minutes to talk to you about this. So I'm really looking forward to some questions, and I'm going to stop sharing screens, but you can get the PDF on the website of the Goethe Institute. We'll arrange that it's downloadable, or that you can get it emailed if you signed up for this. And at the very end of the PDF is also a series of articles that are on my Medium blog that you can learn more about all the things that I just sort of touched on today. Thank you so much. And over to Ruth to get some questions.
So it would be really good if you could add your questions to the Q&A box. Seria muito legal se vocês pudessem colocar suas perguntas ali na caixinha do Q&A. E I'm going to start with the first one that was actually even before you started, which is how to develop interesting ways to apply regenerative concepts in education initiatives to students finishing high school.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Wow. Very important question. I've spent a large part of my professional life working with education because I believe that ultimately that's the meta design shift. If we shift worldview and value systems, if we shift the way we meet the world and see the world, we can shift everything downstream, how we design, what we design. And I must say, I personally haven't done so much work with high school students. I've mainly worked with university students, but a friend of mine in Norway has set up a institute called the Small Earth Institute, and she is looking at exactly that. How do we work with high school students on regenerative cultures? And I think she's already listed a lot of resources on the website. So if you Google Small Earth Institute Norway, you'll probably find some inspiration. But if I had to answer the question just spontaneously, for me, so much is about educating kids about a connection to the natural environment and taking them out of the classroom and letting them experience vibrant ecosystems as much as possible and work with natural environments. And I know that's not always possible in city environments, but bringing some kind of nature into the classroom, working with even if it's just in the courtyard, a little bit of container-based gardening and a little bit of permaculture, bringing plants into the classroom and involving the students into maintaining and caring for them. All of that, you can abstract really key lessons from biomimicry and also regenerative design based on that. But that's just a starting point. Okay.
Amazing, thank you. And then we have a long question here, which is, we are working in Brazil with some huge communities who are dealing not only with traditional and innovative knowledge, but which are developing new ways of living in communities, supporting themselves, creating alternative technologies, which we think could contribute to a kind of a regenerative culture, not only for those communities, but also for many other social sectors. What do you ever heard about them? And beyond this, are we able to interconnect many of this and other communitarian initiatives all over the world? So I reckon he's talking about eco-villages or sustainable intentional communities.
So I have spent a lot of the last 10, 15 years with the Global Eco-Village Network movement, and I've lived in Findhorn Eco-Villages, in the Findhorn Eco-Village for 4 years. And I'm very excited. Like the last time I was in Brazil was at Rio Mais Vence in the UN Summit on Sustainable Development. And I met a lot of the people in CASA, the Latin American network of eco-villages. And I think these intentional communities working in place, working with indigenous communities in many cases in South America are key innovation places where we can learn a lot. And the key bit about my book's title is Designing Regenerative Cultures. It's plural. We need to match them to the unique conditions of place and culture. And so we need more of these experiments. And we also need to find ways of how to infiltrate mainstream communities in suburban and urban environments. Sometimes there's a benefit from working on small-scale eco-village intentional community because it allows, like, you have more buy-in, you have a group that wants to live differently, so it allows for much more rapid iterations in your innovation cycle and learning. But it tends to always be somewhat removed from the majority world, from how most people that are still running in some kind of treadmill are living. So while we need these experiments and they're really important, and I think GEN and CASA are good networks to start interconnecting them in terms of more the technological innovation side. The peer-to-peer network is a wonderful platform to bring them together. Yes, it's about local innovation in global collaboration and exchange. Let's have more of it.
Great. And there are quite a few questions here about business and commerce and regeneration. So maybe I'll read a couple of them and maybe you can give an answer. Mm-hmm. So the first is, what could a SEVA economic system look like? And then another question is whether there are companies applying the concept of regenerative design within highly competitive systems. And then what are some of the challenges of implementing that kind of change at the executive level? So a little bit a dream question about what could the civil economic system look like, and what are some examples or some of the challenges of implementing this?
Okay, so in terms of I'm actually part of a global research project at the moment that is looking into what regenerative economies might look like. And in many ways, this question, what would a service-focused economy look like, is very akin to that. And what I'm beginning to get towards is, if ultimately over the course of evolution, life has created conditions conducive to life by increasing the amount of bioproductivity in the planet and basically making the planet more inhabitable, making it lusher, more abundant, storing up generation over generation and over generation, a wealth of biodiversity and energetic and material abundance that life thrives off, then we could say that while the second law of thermodynamics, the march towards entropy, still holds in the large time scale of universal time patterns, on the time scale of our planet Earth, only a few billion years, which is nothing in terms of universal time patterns, life is actually a syntropic force. Life pushes the march towards entropy in the other direction. And so I'm answering with a higher level question again. A seva economy is an economy that is a syntropic economy, that creates conditions conducive to life, that is salutogenic, that is increasing the health and vitality and capacity to respond to change of the system at different scales, from local to regional to global. And I know that's relatively abstract. And I think that just as with the question, what would a regenerative economy or regenerative economies look like? We have ideas, we have models, we have case studies that are definitely giving us hope that we can do this. But we are in the middle of living the questions together. Don't expect answers and be somewhat suspicious of anybody who will say, yes, sure, I'll give you the answer to this kind of question. And it's the same coming to the corporate questions. I have big questions about how some large companies can be transformed. I had the pleasure of working with a unique large company that is still family owned and therefore not having to bow to the pressure of profit maximizing shareholders. But most of the large corporations that can't even decide for themselves how they make the shift from being degenerative monsters destroying the planet to being regenerative participants, decentralizing production and consumption in such a way that they become knowledge holders for regenerative networks, they might not be able to do this because in the short term, it might be less profitable than following a different path. But the reality is it's only less profitable, or it's seemingly more profitable, because we tend to externalize all the impacts and socialize all the costs that these impacts have. So yeah, it's a long journey, and I think it will take a lot of soul searching for large corporations. And I pull my hat to anybody who's trying to work with one of these large corporations in a regenerative way. I'm open to joining the conversation, but I don't have answers. I just have ideas. I have a lot of questions that we need to ask to do that. Thank you.
And maybe just to ask a fragment of one question that was asked here. So knowing that it's this big challenge in order to change the worldview and the mindset from the people in charge in these corporations, which do you think is going to happen sooner? Do you think that these companies will end up dying, or, going through a cycle of breakdown? Or do you think the planet will, succumb, or humanity will succumb first?
Well, I think we definitely have one glimmer of hope, that none of this is about trying to save the planet. Gaia will be absolutely fine without us. So one could even be facetious in saying, well, maybe she would be a lot better if we just exited faster. It's unfortunately like that unless we change our behavior. But we have the potential of becoming healing and stewarding elements within Gaia once we understand that we are Gaia. And so in that sense, these large corporations, well, we might see human civilization as we know it collapse before some of these corporations will change. And if anybody's not watched Jem Bendel's video on deep adaptation, please Google it. It's worth watching, because he spells out that we are facing imminent near-term human extinction if we don't change our ways. And we have left the window of opportunity so small that even if we start changing our ways, we don't have guarantees anymore that we will make it. We will have to find it within us, and that's the species level rite of passage. We have to act even if we don't know whether the outcomes is going to save us. And that very action from that place in service of life and future generations is the transformative process. And I'm not sure how many large corporations are willing to make that shift. But as I hinted at before, my guess is that if you want to, just as when the dinosaurs were still around and there were little shrew-like little mammals running between their feet, and the dinosaurs were the megafauna, well, we have agile, small bioregional companies who are already acting regeneratively between the feet of the dinosaurs of large multinational corporations at the moment. But I also don't want to say that there isn't a lot of wealth in the people, in the knowledge, in the tradition of these large corporations, and that I don't want to bedevil them in any way. But my sense is that for them to be relevant in the second half of this century, or even within the next 10, 15 years, they need to start to look at how to match what they're doing, their whole supply webs, onto a much more regionalizing level. They can become global networks of knowledge holders, but they need to free all the patents and move towards an open source innovation pattern, because this is ultimately not about what company succeeds anymore. It's about whether humanity finds a future in the community of life, or whether we go extinct and in the process erode so much of life's inheritance of the last 3.8 billion years. So watch this space. The jury's still out. And as I've just recently seen an article that I wrote in 2004 where I quote Donella Meadows saying that when people ask her, do we still have enough time? She always says the same thing. We just have enough time if we start today. And I think that's it. We need to all do our best to see whether we can turn this oil tanker around before it's too late.
And I think maybe a common thread amongst 3 or 4 questions here is about the evidence. So both as in what are some references or case studies or examples of this scale-linked regeneration where, you know, a local initiative for regeneration actually had systemic impacts and could be scaled. And another is also how do we build the evidence so people will believe? So like from, you know, economists to politicians to people who are sitting on the board in large corporations, like how do we build the evidence? Where is the evidence? Like how do we build a business case?
I take a little, like, I know that we love looking at performance indicators and evidence. I mean, there's a lot of evidence, but it is anecdotal. It is specific storytelling evidence. It's like you've seen the pictures of the Loess Plateau. There are other places in Ethiopia, in Senegal, where similar large-scale ecosystems restoration is happening. A lot of ecovillages have been involved in ecosystems restoration for a long, long time, and they can demonstrate that the the springs start flowing again and the water comes back. There are companies who can demonstrate that they've improved the social cohesion in their communities and increased the positive effects on the environment. But I think we have to watch out. We just have to get on with the work. We know what we have to do. We know that we have to shift towards a biomaterials economy. We know that we have to re-regionalize production and consumption. We know we have to find ways to meeting our basic human needs more regionally in global collaboration. And the evidence will build itself. But what I would almost say as a note of caution, because I've seen this in my work with the Sustainable Development Goals, it seems to me we've got it wrong with the SDGs at the moment. We're spending probably 2/3 of the time, if not 3/4 of the time, looking at voluntary local reports and national reports and how are we getting on and what are our indicators, and we're so obsessed with making the evidence case that we divert most of the energy from actually doing the work. And so since we're so early on in this start of the regeneration rising, let's just get on with the work. And I'm not saying not build an evidence case, but build the evidence by doing it in this kind of specific place-based anecdotal way of, look, it worked for us here. And if you abstract from it, you might be able to learn from that. But please, whatever you abstract, make sure that it fits your culture and your place if you try to transfer it from one place to another. So again, I'm somewhat evading the answer, but it's how I would see this. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And there are lots of really good questions here left, but we're running out of time. Ainda tem várias perguntas aqui ótimas, mas a gente já vai ter que ir terminando. Que português maravilhoso. E eu vou... So, I'd like to thank you, Daniel, for your time and for sharing your wisdom and your experience and your questions and also your, doubts with us. And now Flávia will just share a few words about the cycle of regenerative design here in Brazil.
Just briefly, I offered this. Yeah, I offered this after the last webinar, and I don't think I've actually got the list yet, but I can try at some point to answer some of these questions on the Medium blog. So once, if we manage to download the questions, I can go through them and see whether I can just answer some of them in writing.
Excellent.
Over to you, Flávia.
Really good news.
Thank you.
There are some big questions here. Thank you, Flávia. Com você, querida.
Boa. E complementando também, todos que estão participando do webinar e que também se inscreveram e algumas pessoas não puderam, quer dizer, algumas não, várias pessoas não puderam estar junto, vocês vão receber um e-mail com a apresentação do Daniel, com o link para esse webinar e alguns outros links que ele citou. Então, tem também esse e-mail onde vocês vão ter acesso a essas referências, né? Eu quero aproveitar para dizer que a maneira como curatorialmente a gente está pensando o ciclo design regenerativo é criar um caminho de aprendizagem onde, por esses webinars, o Daniel começa a apresentar conceitos chaves para um entendimento do que é regeneração, de fato, que não seja simplesmente deixa a terra lá e que a natureza regenera, mas qual é o nosso papel nessa história, né? E aí, a partir disso, a gente tem, em março, uma série de encontros presenciais. O próximo encontro presencial é no dia 22 de março, à noite, onde o Daniel vai fazer uma palestra de abertura no Instituto Goethe, com o lançamento do livro em português, que está sendo editado pela editora Bambual. E essa palestra, e no dia seguinte, no sábado, no dia 22, um workshop de dia inteiro. A ficha de inscrição está começando a ser lançada hoje, está sendo lançada agora, no site designerregenerativo.org. A gente também vai ter, no dia 24, um workshop com o Daniel no Rio de Janeiro, e no dia 26, um workshop curto de 3 horas com o lançamento do livro em Brasília. E no final de semana, de 28 a 31, o curso imersivo com o Daniel. Então, é uma agenda que, se vocês puderem acompanhar, vocês vão ter um aprofundamento real do design regenerativo. E vale dizer que as atividades que estão sendo realizadas pelo Goethe Institute são atividades gratuitas, e então é uma oportunidade que vocês não devem perder. Aproveito também para agradecer imensamente essa equipe técnica que está por trás de fazer esse webinar acontecer, com legenda, com qualidade de transmissão, a parceria na realização com o Goethe Institute, a presença da Ruth Andrade nessa facilitação, e uma honra de ter o Daniel trazendo o conceito com tanta clareza, um conceito que é extremamente complexo e fundamental e necessário nesse momento, mas com tanta clareza e facilidade, vamos dizer assim, de entendimento para a gente. Muito, muito grata. Boa.
Obrigado a todos.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Bye.